Welcome to the Stateside Signal, a podcast orienting the Two Every Tribe family to the church, the culture, and the future of missions. In this insider podcast, we'll provide the signal you need for the noise so you can stay focused on the work. Welcome.
All right. Well, hey, welcome everybody. I'm glad that you are watching this video, this conversation. I'm excited to bring it to you here, and I'm also excited for the guest that we have with us today. We do have Dr. Michael Cooper with us, and Michael's somebody that I met, I believe, in 2019, right before COVID. We met at a conference, and the way that I met him, I was in a meeting with the head of the mission agency that Michael's with, and we were having a conversation about missionary training, and he just said, "You've got to meet Michael Cooper. You've got to meet this guy," and he was very adamant about it. I saw him in the hallway a couple times. "You've got to meet. You got to have dinner at my table tonight. You got to meet." So at the conference, got to sit next to Michael, and we had a conversation about Ephesians and the book of Ephesians and a passion of his, which is a study of Ephesus and the Ephesian movement and all the church planting. And at that time, he had a book getting ready to be released called Theology, which I don't know if you would call that kind of your landmark book or your kind of anchor book, but of all the many books that you've written. But I got to know him and partner with him in a lot of different ways. And so I'm glad he's here. He's a missionary trainer. He's done his studies at Trinity. He's got a PhD in intercultural studies, and he's also just been involved for 10 years as a church planter in Romania right after the fall, which that was the Wild West back then in those areas.
Yeah, it was.
And then he now serves as a missiologist and a trainer for East West Ministries, and has really spent a large portion of his career training people around the world, everywhere from India to Nepal to, he just came back from 8 countries you said?
Yeah, eight countries.
8 countries in the past couple weeks. So he's just been involved in a lot of training, a lot of international global training, and setting up an international training global training center online. So there's a lot to his storyline, and so welcome, Michael. We're glad that you are here, and I'm glad you're able to join us.
It's fun. It's always fun to be with you, Steve. And good to see you too, Matt. Maybe he's not on the video, but he's in the background somewhere. So good to see Matt as well. But yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. It's good, and I thought of you because the topic that we're talking about today is the role of the missionary in church planting. And how do we understand this role biblically? How do we take what we've seen in the New Testament, especially in the advancement of the gospel among the nations, and primarily as we look at the Apostle Paul, how do we understand his role? And what's prescriptive, what's descriptive as we're looking at this work? And this is a really big topic. And Michael, you've got over 3 decades of ministry, and I'm in the same camp of a little over 3 decades of ministry. And this topic of the role of the missionary, are they a pastor? Are they a pioneer planter? Can we use the word apostle or not use the word apostle? This topic has been alive since I started in ministry. And I know the same for you. Just tell me a little bit from your background, like kind of what have you experienced with this conversation? How have you seen it ebb and flow? And then why do you think it kind of bubbles up to the surface? And it's kind of bubbling up now, and kind of, what are some of your reflections on that?
Yeah, this is a great topic and an important one. And to be honest, when I first went into missions, I don't honestly recall any of us talking about what we so typically refer to as APEST, apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher, that we take from Ephesians chapter 4. And it's only really until I became familiar with Alan Hirsch, a friend of ours, that conversation really begins to become more robust in the world of missions. And so that's late 90s. When did he write The Forgotten Ways?
Yeah.
Late 90s, early
Early
2000s.
2000s. Yeah.
And Alan really, I think, is probably one of those who is primarily responsible for reintroducing this idea of the apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher back into the missions conversation. And for him, of course, he's thinking in the Western context, not so much the cross-cultural foreign context. And that's been a welcome subject, and one that's gotten a lot of traction and a lot of interaction, and I think in very positive ways on the mission side of things. On the other side, if we can divide these up, and I think there's a danger when we do this because we tend to set them against each other, but on the church side, particularly the Western church, there's been a little bit of a reluctance to use language like that historically. And I think it's largely due, and Steve, you might know this better than me, but largely due to the growth of the Pentecostal movement and the use of prophetic gifts and even titles. And even, you think about the number of places you can go around the world and encounter people in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, who have the title prophet or the title apostle or the title evangelist. And I think all of that going on has created quite a confusion about what these things are or who these people are. And has muddied the water, I think, in many ways to what, and Hirsch says as much, what really is a Christological archetype with the apest thing. And so we miss something by not understanding the Christological foundation to the apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher.
Yeah. It's interesting when you look at any of these theological components, the relationship between reacting to bad models versus actually exegeting a biblical model. There's sometimes a tension that goes there.
Yeah. Well, and the tension is only heightened in recent days. Well, maybe in the past couple of decades. I mean, you're going to remember, of course, Peter Wagner in his fuller days when he espoused the idea that church planting is the greatest evangelistic tool under heaven.
Yeah.
And then later, kind of spins off on this new apostolic Reformation movement that I'm sure a lot of the reaction that we see today to these titles of apostle, prophet, at least in the Western context, particularly in the United States, but even increasingly, I was just in Spain, and one of the guys that I've interacted with there was asking me, well, what do you know about the new, the NAR? And I thought, wow, that's here now too. So you get these kind of extreme groups that just create confusion about the biblical nature of people who are gifted in those ways.
Yeah. So I would like to maybe drill down on something really particular on this topic. Because on the one hand, we have this like giant conversation happening here in the West on this, and we're analyzing things, and we're kind of, in some ways, kind of in a laboratory, just like, is this right? Is this wrong? And we're kind of evaluating it from that perch. But then you have the missionary on the ground dealing with an unreached people group or a misreached area or a underreached area, or has got, a small group of believers, first generation converts. And all these kind of bigger topic questions kind of are not the first thing they're thinking about. So when you look at the work of a missionary, um, and this is a bit of a unique question, but if you were to say, how does the missionary span the role between a more pioneer apostolic work versus pastoral work, versus actually opening the scriptures, teaching people, shepherding people, counseling them through their life,
Mhm.
carrying more of what we might call an elder role, versus also, hey, we're in this place, we're trying to bring the gospel to this remote location. And it seems like they live in this polarity between the two roles. um
Mhm.
you know yeah, what are some of your thoughts on that, as you
Yeah.
kind of think about that tension they live in?
Yeah, yeah, and there is a tension there, and I felt that as a young missionary. I was very much the apostolic, visionary church planter, and back in those days, we called those people pioneer church planters.
Yes.
And so I go off kind of on my own to Romania to plant churches, and was able to do that relatively quickly. But one of the things that I learned in doing that was that if somehow you're not also caring for people and you're only focused on the outreach, the spreading of the gospel, the extension of the church across a region, then you're going to end up missing something long term. There's an interesting study. I think maybe I sent it to you. That was done a couple years ago by Todd Lafferty from the International Mission Board of the Southern Baptists. And he looked at their church planting efforts, particularly where they were focusing on movements. And what he learned from his study was that they did an absolutely spectacular job of getting out and doing evangelism and starting churches. And so that's the apostolic evangelistic role. But what they began to see was that as those pioneer, visionary, apostolic, evangelistic types of people continued to spread, that the churches they left behind were weakened because they weren't cared for. And so he advocated in his study that all of that needs to happen. We need not only the folks who are out on the front line spreading and extending the gospel, planting churches, but we need those who are going to come alongside and care for people as well. And I think he's right. I think in my observation of what's happening globally speaking, that we've done in the missions world, the church planting world, and that's on both sides, in the traditional sense as well as in the movement sense. We've done well in seeing churches started, but where we're weak is seeing them continue.
Mm-hmm.
And at some level, that's happening here too, isn't it? In the
Mm-hmm.
United States, we're closing churches at an unprecedented rate right now.
Yeah.
I think by some estimates, one study I read was suggesting there could be as many as 15,000 close in this year.
Mm.
That is unprecedented, and this has only started. I mean, this variance between the number of churches we're starting and those closing just really started in 2019,
Mm.
before COVID.
Mm-hmm.
But we've been on this trajectory. And so what that's indicating is that we're good at starting churches. And in fact, what we're seeing is numbers of churches starting has maintained, and in some cases it increases. But congregation sizes are going down. People are walking away from the faith. And on top of that, then you have churches closing.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a real problem in this context that I think eventually is going to be reflected around the world, because it seems as if we have this penchant as Western missionaries to take our models to other places and try to replicate those. And And I'm concerned really in the next 10 years that we might be seeing a global decline of the church. And it's because we're out of balance. We're good at starting, that we're not as good at maintaining. And even in the maintaining, that so-called pastoral role, it leans far more on the teaching than it does on the caring. We had Steve Besner, who's a professor at Baylor University, on a podcast recently, and we were talking about this. He trains pastors at Baylor, and we were reflecting on how the people that we're equipping in our seminaries are being equipped to teach, because that's the model they see before them every day. A professor standing before them and waxing eloquently on some topic that he or she thinks important. And that's what the future pastor takes with them to the pulpit. And so Sunday after Sunday, you're basically getting the seminary lecture, perhaps the lecture light, I suppose. But it's still that model. And so the teaching that we have in the United States is bar none. Great teaching, great exposition of Scripture. But where we're lacking, it seems, is in the care of the congregation, and specifically related to the pastor caring for the congregation. And we're lacking in the church planting evangelistic sides of this as well.
Go ahead, Matt.
I have a question. I'm curious, Michael, what happened in 2019 that started that trajectory? Because that's really surprising that it's pre-COVID.
Yeah, it surprised everybody that it was pre-COVID. And I don't know that anybody has quite put their finger on it, even though what we've been seeing year over year is a decline in the numbers of people who identify as Christian, beginning in the 1990s and really taking off in the 2000s. And so in one sense, I think it's just caught up to us, and it's taken people by surprise. But I'm sure there are multiple factors that are causing this rate of closure of churches to continue.
Do you think, when you think about the heavy emphasis on teaching and that teaching model, I'm curious, that model it can and does exist very well in the United States. And sometimes I wonder, does it exist well because we have so many support ministries around us? So, for example, if I need a new Bible, I don't have to translate it, into my language. I don't have to create a dictionary for my language. I don't have to then spend the next 30 years record. I just go to Amazon and I go, I want an ESV Bible, and one gets sent to me, and Crossway is doing all that work for me, or and so we have all kinds of support organizations and marriage conferences and child raising conferences and radio programs. It seems like we've got this massive support system that can allow us to kind of hyper focus on one or two aspects of ministry. And then you go cross-culturally and you have to get the Bible translated sometimes. There is no support ministry. There's no radio ministry. There's no publishing company providing for you books on how to raise your family. And so I wonder, that sometimes the hyper focusing on a particular skill, do you think it's just because we just have so many other support systems around us, and then somebody says, yes, I'm going to now go overseas and just be a teacher, and then they realize this isn't working, and it isn't because the scriptures aren't sufficient. The scriptures are very sufficient, but that realization that we're actually benefiting from a lot of other parachurch organizations. I'd love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I think in part, for sure, that's happened, and we've had this conversation before about in a society where things like this happen, there's a fragmentation that occurs. And historically in Western culture, we see this beginning in the Industrial Revolution and perhaps even before. I mean, with the Protestant Reformation, there's a sense of fragmentation that's occurring at the church level, if not at the social level. But moving forward from there, that fragmentation then creates silos. And so everybody feels like that they can do, what they're doing, and they do it the best way that they can, and their way is the way in which it should be done. And so you have this fracturing of Christianity, like we've seen in the West, and globally speaking, where I think by some estimates, there are as many as 36,000 different evangelical organizations and denominations, which is crazy to think about. And so I think that certainly happens and is a part of that. But I think another issue is that in the midst of all of this education that we have in the West, in all of these great institutions that seem like increasingly they're closing around the country, but in spite of that, and probably as a result of that, we believe that we have what Christopher Wright would call a contextless theology, meaning that because it came from the West and we have all these great resources, that we must have the theology that we can take now from the West and impose it on other parts of the world. And I think that contributes too to some of the issues that we're facing.
Mm-hmm.
And at some level, I mean, we can even break that down to a contextless ecclesiology.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned I was in Spain and I was speaking with a group of church planters, and I introduced my topic with a phrase that I picked up from Jeff Christopherson. And Jeff likes to say that we live in the 21st century, planting churches with a 16th century ecclesiology in a context that looks more like the first century. And I think he's right. The churches that we're starting today, for the most part, don't look all that different from churches that were beginning in the 16th century. And there's something tragic about that, I think. But that's a part of the issue. When you have a Western church that believes that it is the model, the New Testament model, and I did this when I was a missionary. I went to Romania and planted the only New Testament church in Romania. And it just so happened to look like my church in St. Louis. But because I thought that the way in which we did church planting was the biblical way, was the New Testament way. And it's taken a lot of years to realize that, the church must emerge in the context and take on the characteristics of a context, just like the Western church has done.
Mm-hmm. So to kind of dive in specifically on that, I've got kind of maybe two different questions, but just to kind of drill in a little bit. It's very important, I think, in our context, meaning the United States or Western context, to have things defined, to have titles and to have like some real crisp clarity around things. And oftentimes when you're doing work in a cross-cultural context, those definitions they don't matter. Like I don't know if any of our missionaries that are watching this are getting up every day trying to figure out their job description and how are they going to define what they did today in light of certain words. And they're just getting up, doing their job, right? Making disciples and engaging people and solving problems and all of that. Yet in certain cultures, definitions are important. If you have a family-based culture, making sure that you are presenting yourself with your family is important. If you think about missionaries who are serving in places where there's a stronger high church or ancient Catholic presence, like a historic Catholic presence, And you just talked about Spain, being one of those places. Do you think it's important to bring some definition and titles to the missionary? So, for example, we might use the word, "Hey, you're doing a pioneer work." Let's say we'll just grab that word from the '90s that we used in the early days, right? And our training ministry used to be called the Center for Pioneer Church Planting, right? It's like pioneer was the buzzword. We and you go to Spain, well, that word pioneer isn't going to hold. So would we say, "Hey, I am going to use a clergy word. I'm going to use a high church word"? Do you think there's some fruit or value for a missionary to maybe look contextually and say, "Hey, I might want to give some definition around myself in a way, if that is cultural currency, not a liability, because there are some places we've been where the historic churches have abused people, and we don't want to align with that. But if there are places where that's important, what do you think about that?
Yeah. Yeah, I love that question. And I think in part we can look to Paul, of course, for some help here. He never bore the title, as an apostle. I mean, he was an apostle, and he acted like an apostle. But when he's in the midst of his ministry, he's not saying, "I, the apostle Paul, say to you," whatever. But he takes on the characteristics of the culture. You think of 1 Corinthians 9 as the hallmark of what that looks like. And so when he's in Corinth, he takes on the work of a leatherworker, and he's engaging people in trade guilds and so on. When he's in Athens, he takes on the role of a philosopher. At some level, and there's some discussion about this in terms of Ephesus, but at some level, the same applies there, where he's engaging trade guilds, but he's also teaching in the school of Tyrannus and so on. So I think, looking at the culture and trying to understand what is it that's going to give me a sense of legitimacy in being here that's culturally congruent and acceptable. And I think that's where we need to look. Using the title of a missionary, I think these days, and perhaps for the past couple of decades, it's been somewhat problematic. And problematic for a couple reasons. One is that sometimes missionaries are looked at as being a colonial instrument. Mm-hmm. They're going into a place, and they're in. This goes back to the 4th century. They're coming into a region. They're bringing a certain ecclesiology that's connected to a certain culture and so on. And it's being imposed on a new culture. And that's something that has been characteristic, unfortunately, of the missionary's role. But I think, secondly, it's problematic because when you identify as a missionary in a foreign country, people are saying, "What is that? What do you do?
Right.
What do you do from 8 to 5 every day?"
Exactly. Where does this money come from? I don't see you producing anything.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I mean, your office is in your home. Or whatever.
Yeah.
And so there are some problems with that. So I think the more that we can, in contemporary missions, the more that we can identify the third spaces, those spaces where we have a natural affinity, and we can come into those spaces and engage people in those spaces, the better that's going to be for the work overall. And so it's if we have the skills of a leather worker, it's looking for our leather worker brothers and sisters and coming alongside of them. Mm-hmm. If we have skills as a philosopher, it's looking for the philosophers and coming alongside of them. And I've wondered if this isn't something of what Paul was intending when he says to the Corinthians, where God has called you, stay in that place. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so but there's a lot that that's on the field side, and then there's the other question about what's the perception of the missionary on this side? How does the church view
Yes.
missionaries' role and so on? And
Yes.
I think, to be honest, Steve, I think there's a lot of danger when the church is dictating the role of the missionary on the field. Because what often happens is that church dictates the missionary's role based on what the church in its own context believes that missionary
Mhm.
should be doing, rather than considering the cultural context where the missionary lives.
Well, you touched on kind of the next question, and you almost answered all of it, but it was to say, hey, how do you translate some of those expectations? For example, if a church would say to a missionary, hey, man, we really think that, there are no elders in this place. You need to serve as the pastor of this church. You're the elder. You need to carry that role. And that missionary might say, well, hey, I'm a discipler. I'm raising up people. No, you need to call yourself an elder. You need to
Hmm.
call yourself the pastor. They need to respond to you as the pastor. Yeah. How would talk to that missionary to say, hey, I understand that tension you're feeling with the church, but, and how would we actually biblically define their role? Like, not pragmatically, how do you translate your culture back home, right? That's a work missionaries always have to do.
Yeah.
But biblically, like, what's the biblical instruction? And is there an element of the form and the title? There's the work we
Mhm.
do, and then the actual titling of that work.
Yeah.
So I'm throwing a lot at you there, but just, yeah, what advice would you get to help them shape
Yeah.
this?
Yeah, well, first, I think that when a church does that and kind of mandates to the missionary or dictates to the missionary that this is what you need to do, it's coming from this idea that the church in the West believes that it's a contextless ecclesiology, that the way in which it does church, leadership, liturgy or whatever, should be done everywhere. That should raise questions in our minds. So that's one, and I think missionaries can be encouraged to understand that all churches come from a context, and they structure themselves in that context in ways that make sense in that context.
Mhm.
But secondly, I think a part of the kind of the historical, cultural, first century background that we have to understand is that all of those words that we today have translated from Greek into English, pastor, elder, deacon, they all come out of a context where those words were used in the civil society.
Mhm.
They were government words. They weren't Christian words. They weren't religious words necessarily. Even interestingly enough, the same with the word apostle. The apostle was used in nautical writings about somebody who led navies into different places. And so all of those words have a context from which Paul then borrows and adapts for the church. And the unfortunate result of that has been that those have become sacrosanct in Christianity now. And therefore, because Paul used the word pastor or elder or deacon or bishop or whatever, we have to use that as well. I don't think that was what Paul's intention was. I think he was looking at the context. He was looking for language that would communicate meaningfully to the structuring of the church, and that structuring of the church would provide a part of the ability for the church to replicate and multiply, because those words were already inherent in the culture itself. So it wasn't creating something new. And so I think that's important for us to keep in mind, as well as missionaries in the foreign field, that if we're going to do the work like Paul does the work, we need to be finding the language in that field that's going to be meaningful for the church so that it can replicate, rather than imposing our language onto a church, and which results in that church being looked at as being foreign. That we need to think of what is the meaningful terminologies that we need to be using regarding leadership, whatever it would be, so that the church would more easily replicate.
Do you think that that's the meaning of the word is the value kind of, is that where you're like, for example, if we use the word pastor, or the word, the word shepherd or pastor.
Yeah.
There was a definition of a shepherd, right? There was a role that a shepherd did, a function. The word that was used in that day would have been the word shepherd. We want to preserve that role, right? It's not that we just want to grab that title, make that title, and then redefine that title throughout history to become the CEO of a gathering.
Right.
We're saying, no, it was somebody who, smelled like sheep. It was somebody who like cared for sheep,
well,
right?
Yeah.
Is that kind of where you're going?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, what's interesting about the word, I just wrote an article with Adam Amberg that came out last month in Global Missiology on revisiting contextualization was the title of it, and we're proposing missiological parallelisms as a way in which we should be thinking as we're engaging culture. And one of the examples that I used in the article was exactly this word for shepherd, because so often we think of the shepherd in the first century context as, being that lowly person out in the field and he smells like sheep and so on. Yet the metaphor of shepherd was used extensively, even in the biblical literature. You think of David being a shepherd. And given responsibility to care for Israel. But in the Greco-Roman world, and especially in the Roman Empire, emperors were using the word shepherd to communicate how they cared for the people in the empire. And so that the metaphor there is important. The title isn't.
Right. The idea of care, like this carries the idea of care, mothering, nurturing, stewarding. And we don't want to lose that meaning to then to protect a word.
Exactly.
That can, and maybe this is a bit, because this is an inside conversation, we can use this word here because it definitely would just be a trigger word in the world today. But the word gay, right? So if you if it was 1920, you could say, how are you feeling today? I feel gay. That word itself would have been, I'm feeling good, I'm feeling happy, right? And today would have a completely different meaning.
Yeah.
So the idea of, hey, what was that meaning at the time? If I'm reading a song written in 1917, and the songwriter said, I feel gay, I'm not interposing that he's saying that he's same-sex attracted, right? And so I think that, right? I mean, so the idea is like, what is that meaning, instead of just isolating on the term itself?
Right. Yeah. So this in missions conversations, we talk about this as form and meaning.
Yeah.
There are places where we want to preserve both the form and the meaning, but there are other places and this is the example that you're giving with the word pastor. We want to preserve the meaning. Let's change the form to make it relevant for where we're starting churches. So what is the role of that person? What do they call that person in that culture? And it could very well be that in many cultures, and we know this in many cultures, especially tribal cultures, there's a real understanding of what a shepherd is. And so maybe whatever that word is in that culture is the word that needs to be used to convey the role, the meaning.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'll shift topics as we kind of start to wrap up here a little bit. But just on this topic, I was thinking about Paul speaking to the Thessalonians and saying, I was like a nursing mother to you. Like, it was an interesting, he probably could have used the word shepherd there, right? But instead he decides to draw the picture how he cared for them and the care took on the image of a nursing mother
Mhm.
as opposed to saying, I shepherded you, right?
Yeah.
But yet, so would you say that's maybe a biblical example of that, where that
Yeah,
the meaning is being carried forth, not necessarily just the word?
for sure. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
So then there are titles in our day, which we can't escape this, right? Like that a lot of these words are now titles and they're positions and they're
Mhm.
positions that have incomes connected to them, right? So when you look at um, a missionary kind of who probably doesn't care about the title. I don't think any of our missionaries are sitting here saying, I want the title of missionary or apostle or pastor or whatever. They're just doing their work, yet these words do carry titles. What advice would you give to a missionary to say, hey, you're doing all of this, but I do recognize that these titles are important for the people who are paying your salary, for your donors, so to speak. What advice
Mm.
would you give them in terms of just how do you care for that? How do you steward that polarity they live in?
Yeah, wow, that's a great question. And I think that's a hard one to answer because it really comes down to the church here that's supporting them and what their expectations are. The reality of our world today is that we're tremendously fractured, and increasingly that's what we're seeing even in the area of missions. Not as much as what we see in terms of denominations, but certainly it's there. And so I think the best thing to do in those circumstances is to have open and honest conversations about who the missionary is, what the missionary is doing. And I think it's particularly important for churches to understand that for a church to be rooted in culture where the missionary is working, it has to look like the culture. It can't look foreign. And this is so important. Where Lori did her master's focused on persecution. And one of the things that she learned in doing that was that one of the reasons why the church around the world is persecuted is because it looks foreign in the field where it's been planted. And so in India, if the church looks like an American church, or in Nepal, if it looks like an American church, that makes it a target. And this has been historic ever since the Christianization of the empire and the invasion of the Sasanians from Persia into Asia Minor and into the Levant. The churches were always a target because they were associated with the culture and associated with power and authority and so on. And so this we see, and we see this historically in missions. China, for example, Japan as well, where missionaries were put out of the country because of the concern that they were bringing and introducing a foreign culture. And so it's important, I think, for the missionary to have that kind of conversation with their home church, to let them know for their own security where they are, that they can't take on these titles. And in fact, in some places, it's dangerous to take on those titles. And they can't plant churches that look like they're American churches. That just makes them a target. And so I think those things are important conversations that need to be had with the churches back home.
I've got one more question, and Matt, I don't know if you have any follow-ups, but my last question is a bit of a diversion, or kind of just a little bit of a sharp left turn.
Real quick, Steve,
Yeah, go ahead.
do you mind if I insert just a response question to that?
Yeah. Please
Just
do.
stay on the topic for a minute, because that was a really powerful point, Michael. And I'm wondering if you have like an example or two of where uh, taking American church forms and imposing them into a new, dangerous kind of culture setting in another culture. Yeah, do you have any examples of where that's caused more problems?
Yeah, yeah. I think India is the case study in this. For the past decade or more, the fanatical Hindu has targeted churches, and because of their not being connected with Indian culture, and so whenever you read about churches being destroyed in the Indian context, it's largely due to I don't want to generalize here, and I want to be careful. Um, um, but there's a factor, a Western factor that plays into the church becoming a target in these different cultures, and it's because they look foreign. The church was never intended to look foreign. From day one, when Christ incarnates in Israel, he gives us a model of what the body of Christ is to do in culture, and that's to incarnate as well. So, and Steve, I think we've had this conversation before about the inability of a missionary to incarnate in culture just simply because we don't have the same lived experiences. We don't speak the language as fluently as, excuse me, as others do. But when we talk about the body of Christ, if Christ is our example, then the body of Christ can incarnate in culture. And what that means is that it must take on cultural characteristics. It has to look like the culture, dress like the culture, act like the culture. So it can be in the culture and not of the culture. And I think that's important. And in that way, it becomes rooted in the culture and not looked at as being foreign. And we do have early missionary examples of this. You think of Hudson Taylor wearing Chinese garb, others as well taking on cultural characteristics. But we need to recover that, and I think even go beyond. I think we're at a point in missions in the world today that we really need to be thinking about church going into the third spaces, as what I call this. You know, where are those spaces in a culture where people naturally gather together? Is it in is it around a tree? Is it at the riverbank? Is it at a community center? Is it at the workplace? Is it at a restaurant, a pub, or wherever? Where is it that people naturally gather? And think about, what does it mean for the church to be there? What does it mean for us to insert ourselves in there and incarnate as a body of Christ in that context? And that's where you're going to see the church rooted in the culture. I don't know if that helps or not, Matt.
Yeah, I'll go even more granular. If there's an example of the word pastor as a title being
Mhm.
like actually more harmful in the culture you're in, but also put aside the word and title, the function of what an American pastor shepherd usually does. So like what let's say missionaries in a in another culture or context, and they're not using the title, but they are preaching and teaching every week and being the face, like so that as a form itself,
Mm,
is there an example of that form actually being damaging?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, there are, and I can't pull one off the top of my head at the moment, but certainly where that form, that Western form is being replicated in another place, it's being looked at upon as being foreign in that place. And so we need to think about, well, how do we preserve the meaning that's intended behind that form, and take on a new form that will help it to have cultural currency, so to speak.
Mhm. Yeah, doing the work and not getting caught up in the title.
Yeah, yeah,
I think
yeah.
about, and I don't know, um, like you back in the 90s, I had the privilege of getting into, Eastern Europe right after the fall and seeing the residual of the state church under communism and the way that the communist government used some of the state elements of the church to take advantage of people. I still see that today in some parts of Central and East, probably more Central Europe, where there, when they think of a pastor, they think of somebody tied to the government, and they think of somebody who's used as an arm to hurt people. Yet the function of what a pastor is they're crying out for.
Yeah.
They need shepherds. They're sheep without a shepherd. And so, yeah, it's interesting, because it seems like in this conversation, if we can make that delineation between how we might title something versus the function of it,
Yeah. Yeah.
the function is biblical, right?
Yeah.
We want to shepherd the sheep. We want to care for the sheep. We want to serve the sheep. We want to provide wisdom for the sheep as an older elder might do. We want to ensure the widows are fed. We want to make sure that the orphans are cared for, that the flock of God is loved and nurtured. And so all of those things, whether, I'm just using words for elder, deacon, teaching, like all these parts of it. So we want to preserve that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and to preserve it, but not at the expense of the other gifts. We still
Right,
need
yeah.
people who are going out, reaching out evangelistically, who are speaking into the culture prophetically.
Yep.
And so all of that has to function together. Otherwise, we have a very lopsided understanding of what the true body of Christ is. I go back to Alan, and if in fact he's right, and I think he is, that this apest in Ephesians 4:11, the apostles, evangelists, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers, if that's a Christological archetype that resembles who Jesus himself is, and I think we can very easily trace his apostolic, prophetic, evangelistic, shepherding, teaching ministry through the Gospels, then all of that is going to be important in our church plant. And so skewing what we're doing to weigh on the caring and shepherding of people is going to have a negative impact on that church reaching out. And I saw this in a negative way in what we were doing in Romania. When we first began there, and I'll just share this brief story. When we first began in 90, we were reaching out evangelistically. We were going into different cities and doing evangelistic events and looking for opportunities where we might gather groups of people that ultimately would form a church and so on. And in our first church plant in the south central part of the country, it really was amazing. And I'm so thankful that the Lord allowed me to be a part of this, that nearly 100% of that church were new believers, not coming from other churches or any place. And we were very deliberate about that. We didn't want to take from existing churches. We wanted new believers. But what we saw in doing that was that because they came to Christ through personal outreach of others, that's what they did. That's what they knew, that was what it meant to be a Christian. And so they were reaching out to other people. They were doing Bible studies in their homes and so on, because that's what they learned a Christian did. And that was modeled to them by our emphasis on evangelism, discipleship, and so on. What was interesting was, at one point, because I was young, naive, wanting to see all of Romania won for Christ, and over the weekend, I ended up moving. We brought in a pastor who his gifting was to help restore churches in the United States. That's what he did as a ministry. He would go into hurting churches where, if it was pastoral abuse or whatever, and he would go in and care for people and restore the church. So he came over and he became the pastor of the first church that we started. And in a matter of a year, that church changed from being outwardly focused to being inwardly focused, because we were out of balance. We emphasize the caring at the expense of the outreach.
Yeah.
And that lesson has always stuck with me. And that's why I think it's so important for missionaries to be able to communicate to their home churches that all of this is important. If we're not reaching out, if we're not speaking into the culture, if we're not teaching and discipling, if we're not caring for people, then we're out of balance with what it is that Christ wants us to do.
I want to maybe end with a bit of a turn and more of a direct theological question. And basically there's a handful of questions, but I want to kind of put them into one. Okay, kind of a set of thoughts here, but I think that I'd like to end on this topic here of just looking at this theologically or exegetically a little bit here. When Timothy and Titus were instructed to basically put these churches in order, appoint elders and all of the things that they were doing that you see in 1st, 2nd Timothy and Titus. Were they operating as pastors? Like, was Timothy the pastor of the church at Ephesus? Or were they there as part of an apostolic team and under the authority of Paul? So were they part of this? They were there in this kind of that role coming from Paul to the. And then on what basis are they then, on what authority are they laying hands on people and doing this? Like, where does that authority come from? The reason why I'm asking this question is that this kind of becomes the crux of some of the complexities that I know some missionaries feel as pastors. Are they there as pastors of a church in country X, or are they there as a delegation from a team? Are they working as a modality or a sodality?
Yeah.
Then on what authority are they doing their work of setting a church in order?
Yeah. I love that question. The short answer is no. Timothy and Titus were not pastors. That's not the answer that many people want to hear. But
you just untitled like 18 commentaries called the pastoral epistles. I just want you to know that.
That's part of the problem. Is that the term pastoral epistle wasn't put into theological language until the 1800s. Right. And so if you think about it chronologically speaking, we would have to be saying that for 1800 years, that the church didn't know that these were pastoral epistles until some brilliant British theologian decided to give them the label pastoral. And for the past 200 years, that title has stuck, and now it's created this issue with who the pastor is and what the role of the pastor is. So short answer, Timothy and Titus were not pastors. Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't have pastoral gifts. I think more than likely they did have pastoral gifts, that they cared for people, and that seems to be a lot of what Paul is talking about there to both of them is exhibiting some form of care for the church by ensuring that it has leadership that can govern the church properly. Timothy, we know, we assume that he was an evangelist because Paul tells him, do the work of an evangelist. Did he have apostolic giftings? It seems so if we understand those apostolic giftings as crossing cultures. I mean, Timothy was, he co-authors 7 of the 13 letters with Paul, and we rarely talk about that. And I think we need to talk about that. Paul wasn't just this singular, monolithic, apostolic missionary form, the rugged individual that he's become in many of the eyes of Westerners. But he was somebody who collaborated and worked in community with others. And so he co-authors a number of his epistles with others. But he entrusts Timothy too with responsibility. So he sends him, to Thessalonica. He's in a number of places. He's left in Ephesus and so on. So he's given a lot of responsibility that is cross-cultural in nature. And Timothy himself is kind of a cross-cultural person. You know, his father is Greek, his mother is Hebrew. And so there's a natural affinity there for him. It seems as if Timothy has a sort of prophetic role as well. I mean, he's to address some of the problems in the church in Ephesus. And ultimately, we know through an apocryphal work called the Acts of Timothy. Acts of Timothy? I think that's what it's called. That he loses his life in Ephesus because he's speaking out against these cultural atrocities. And so to kind of pigeonhole Timothy into a single title office, I think is misunderstanding the entirety of Timothy's ministry and his relationship with Paul. Titus, we don't know as much about, but yeah.
Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, and maybe this question for both of you guys, because it's more of like a wisdom question for you guys who've been in this longer. But
that's a euphemism for saying you guys are old.
just a gentle way to say it.
Yeah, I'll take the arrow out now.
Yeah. Or I could say you guys are the Pauls for the young Timothys. So the premise underneath this discussion is, in the eyes of Western pastors, if we had like a hierarchical structure, if you put pastor next to a foreign missionary, the pastor might view himself at the top of that. And the assumptions with that could be, I know more exegesis than the missionaries out there.
Mm.
And so I'm curious your advice. If you're a missionary who is typecast that way, but like our missionaries are smart people, like, and they've cut their teeth on scriptures themselves and have been given tool. Like they're not untrained, folks. What is kind of like a posture to address that exegetical assumption that Western pastors might have? So if my sending church, the pastors, if they view me that way as being like lesser exegetically in knowledge and scripture, like what are some suggestions if I'm going to maybe challenge the exegetical conclusions that you've actually come to? Because you're basically affirming maybe where I would stand exegetically, but like I'm kind of trapped in this, like, well, man, you already don't agree with my premise, that I might have a better understanding of this text than you have by calling Timothy a pastor. So I'm just curious how you address that.
When I was in Bible school, if you were a missions major back in the day, it meant you couldn't cut it into pastoral studies. You didn't want to take the languages, so you were just lazy. And so that was like the assumption. The missionaries were like, "Oh, you guys just want to like read the Bible in camp. You guys aren't taking Greek and Hebrew."
Yeah.
So there was a hierarchy of like the pastoral majors, and then the missions majors were the rebels, so to speak.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, this comes down to an exposition. How you land expositionally on this, and so you're kind of might already assume like, well, I kind of think I got a grasp of this, this thing from scripture, but you don't already believe me, and maybe the conclusions with scripture I've come to. So,
yeah, I love that question, and that's a hard one. And now, nearly 40 years on this side of doing mission work and having interacted with numerous pastors in the United States and have been a part of numerous churches, some of which have been wonderful experiences, some of which have not been so wonderful. And it comes down to exactly what you said, Matt, that the pastor has a view of himself as being at the top, the pinnacle of ministry. everybody else, not just the missionary, but everybody else is below him, and that's a dangerous place to be for that pastor and for that church. And so, how you navigate that requires a lot of grace and wisdom. It doesn't. Well, I was going to say it doesn't hurt to come get a PhD with us, so that you have the academic credentials. But even then, I mean, I've been in circumstances where that doesn't even matter, and in fact, it becomes intimidating to some. If not, just being a missionary in and of itself is not intimidating. Sometimes that is intimidating to pastors, because here's a person who has left everything and has actually put into action what that pastor is preaching about in the book of Acts. And that can be intimidating. And so I don't say that to puff up the heads of missionaries, but to say that, handle those circumstances with grace. That's how Christ interacted with you. And I don't know, Steve, you have other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I mean, I appreciate what you're saying, Michael. And there is a very unique tension, and I do think that there's a saying that the questions you go to the Bible with determines the answers you get from the Bible. And sometimes I think we go to the Bible looking for certain things. If we want to go to the book of Ephesians and look for the role of a pastor, how we would define a pastor today, or if we want to go to 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus and look for the role of a pastor, we can find that there. Sometimes I don't think that missionaries are less exegetical. I think they're going with different questions.
Mm-hmm.
And
I mean, they have different experiences, don't they?
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
living in another culture changes everything.
Yeah.
At least that's been my experience. I read the Bible today, not like I read it when I was a university student.
Yeah.
And that continues as much, the more that I'm engaged in other cultures around the world and interacting with people, it just simply changes how we look at ministry and all of these things.
Yeah, so you can look at it, and especially, our culture defines the questions we come to sometimes. So, like, if we say, why don't we come up with a definition of the word church? Well, in the United States, we can say a church has elders, a church has deacons, a church has a formal gathering, it participates in the ordinances, on and on. We can say all those things, but then you ask yourself, well, when did the church become a church? In the New Testament, like Paul and Titus were appointing elders. Was it? Could we call it the church in Ephesus? There weren't elders yet. So some of these definitions we get at, and you say, Paul cycled back around to appoint elders. It says in Acts, amongst the churches. So there's an element of how do you define it? And sometimes the culture is forcing you to consider categories that are different from the categories you live in. And it isn't that categories are wrong here. We've developed very defined theology and very crisp churches. I don't think God is in heaven going, oh, I hate that. It's just where we're at. We've developed this. We can be very particular about, we can design the perfect fast food meal. We can say, I want the Whopper because I want it flame broiled, but I like McDonald's fries, but I want a Wendy's Frosty. There, I've designed my perfect fast food meal. We can be that defined about everything. You can't be that defined in other places. And those definitions, you're in the process of biblically and culturally defining these things. And sometimes you're early on and we can't export those. But it doesn't mean you're doing any less exegesis. I guess that's the point where I'm getting at. You're still doing exegesis. You're just coming with a different set of questions, like the Jerusalem Council. As a good question they had to ask. Are we going to have the Gentiles get circumcised? we're not asking that question today, but they needed to ask that question.
Mm-hmm.
And as a little side note, I kind of feel bad for Timothy because the answer was no. They don't need to be circumcised. Hey, Timothy, though, before we go, we need you to get circumcised. You're just like...
That's not something that we want to dwell on.
Yeah. But he's like, poor guy. Like, I could see Timothy going, but wait a minute, the whole council said we don't have to. Yeah, but you do. But that's just showing you that, like, this is a very lively reality. Like this was a very real-time moment where the culture, and you see it even in the response of the Jerusalem Council. Hey, make sure they don't drink blood. Make sure, like they're still saying, hey, we need to be careful. There's a theological reality that no, circumcision does not equal salvation. So we're going to be clear about that theologically, but culturally, please be aware that you're dealing with Jews. And please don't offend them. And Timothy, I can't have you offend them. So you need to do. So there is an element where they're feeling that tension, but it's very exegetical. I mean, they're applying both the gospel and love, at the same time. And I think that counsel to me kind of points out that, it's a different set of questions. So, well, man, I know we could probably go for another hour. I appreciate this. I think we've only scratched the surface on a very deep topic. I do know that the idea of form, structural form, how much of Paul is prescriptive, how much is descriptive, these kinds of questions surface, but and I know we can't really come up with an answer for all of these questions here today, but man, I'm grateful, Michael, that we're able at least just to talk about contextualization and how do we understand these roles, and preserving the heart, the truth behind it, preserving the truth and not just fixating on a word that actually has maybe been defined away from the truth. So I think that's a helpful discussion, and I know there'll be a lot of discussions that will kind of fly out of this. So, Matt, do you have anything you'd like to land the plane with here? Anything you want to say?
No, that was great. Thank you guys. And thank you, Michael.
Yeah,
my privilege. This was fun.
Cool. Well, thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
And people who are upset with you, which email do you want to send it to? So, no.
Steve.lesson
There you go. There you go.
PET.org. Is that the right one?
Close. But yeah, that's the right one. Yeah, that's the right one. So, cool. All right.